Jump right in. So what you're looking at here is the Prezi for the class. I mentioned there are two Prezis. This one, which has just the first 9 classes, first 9 lectures, then there'll be another one. Notice how this is laid out, though. Down here, we're starting at 2,600 years before the Christian era. This is almost 5,000 years ago. In fact, the Epic of Gilgamesh, which we'll be looking at Thursday, is really 5,000 years old. And it was a little older than the written text because it had an oral tradition beforehand. We're going to go all the way up by the end of the class to the 20th century. And in addition, we're going to be starting in Northern Africa and we're going to be moving over. We're going to jump the Mediterranean to get Greek and Roman culture. We're going to be in Europe, then one side of Europe, England, till we jump over to North America. So this kind of is the mind map. It visually depicts how the course is laid out. And like I said, next week or next class, Thursday, we'll be starting here with that. But let's jump into the introduction. So lecture 1, we're going to really approach 2 questions here. Why we approach environmental issues from a literary perspective, and I think a fair question that we rarely ask in literary courses is why do we read and study literature at all? So hopefully by the end of this class, you'll have an answer to that. So let's just jump right in. By the way, notice these A, B, C, D, E, all the way to H. If you've downloaded the PDF, either and printed it out or have it in a PDF editing software, you can follow along with these. So what is environmental criticism? That's what we're doing in this class. It's environmental literary criticism. And let's give you some definitions here, which will help you understand what it is we're doing and why we're doing it the way we're doing it and all. Environmental criticism is methodologically similar to other forms of cultural criticism. These have been around for, about 50 years now or so. So Marxist criticism, post-colonial criticism, feminist criticism, queer theory and criticism, and a range of others. You may maybe of these be most familiar with feminist or post-colonial. It really depends. But these have been around for, a while. And before that, people would read a text like, like Jane Eyre's Pride and Prejudice or Sense and Sensibility, take it at face value, and not really look at the relationship between male identified and female identified characters. Feminist criticism brought that on the scene. So let me see if this works okay. Perfect. So feminist critics, for example, just one of a number of possibilities we could talk about, are interested in literary representations of gender and women as they change over time. And again, this was not an issue 50 years ago, but it became quite an issue because of the work of these scholars. What we're doing is similar in that we're interested in representations of nature in the natural world as they change over time. So that may be over decades, but in our case, over thousands of years. And remarkably, not just how they change, but how they stay the same as well. So we're going to see some things that are kind of startling in that our view toward the environment hasn't really changed much in certain core ways for nearly 5,000 years. So these issues often intersect. So, for example, there are a group of people, and it's a very important group of scholars working in this field, that are not just ecological literary critics, or not just feminist critics, but are kind of a mashup called eco-feminist critics, who look at environmental issues and feminist issues at the same time. The key term here is that these issues are intersectional. With what we're doing, it's almost impossible not to see these as intersecting with something or other. So even when we look at the Epic of Gilgamesh, feminist issues are going to be clearly there. You could approach that text entirely from a feminist point of view, entirely from an eco-critical point of view, but we're going to do kind of a combination of the two. But it's very rare that these things exist in isolation. For a long time, I think people thought they did, and they approached it as it would. So early feminist critics approached something like the Epic of Gilgamesh without thinking about the environmental implications. But In general, in the 21st, it's all about intersectionality. We're going to talk more about that, but just so you're familiar with the idea here. So, changing perceptions of gender, literary representations, they're not only generated by particular cultures, they play a role in generating those cultures, and it creates kind of a feedback loop. So what do I mean by that? Use a more modern example, use Jane Austen, Pride and Prejudice. Well, on the one hand, when an author like that writes a story, a narrative, they reflect the time. So many of the ideas that Jane Austen is writing about are not her own. They're the time speaking through her. So if it is a misogynistic patriarchal culture, it's probably going to show up in the novel. So in that sense, they are generated by a particular culture. Many, many writers do not go beyond that. They just write about they express the values of their culture and they don't change it. I won't use Jane Austen example, but one I hope you may have read in high school, someone like Frederick Douglass. On the one hand, is Frederick Douglass, are the values of his time clearly on display in his, text clear. But in his narrative, he also generates something new. Something new comes on the scene. That's what makes authors like Frederick Douglass and his contemporary, who we're going to read at the end of the course, Henry David Thoreau, so important. Yes, they reflect the times. They're a good reflection of the times, but they are also harbingers of something new. They're running out ahead of the culture, imagining, writing about something new. We may not always realize it. We might not realize it at the time. Hold on a second. But over time, if they really are representative of a new culture, and they make a difference. Sorry. So if you want to understand contemporary attitudes toward modern US environmental issues, plus its literary history, that's the place to go. So that might seem kind of surprising. We're going to address that by the end of the lecture today, why you would look at a literary text to do this. But just as you would look at, Frederick Douglass's narrative, it can tell you enormous amount about the time and enormous about how the times were changing and shifting into something new. So that's why, and I'll make the case even stronger as we get to it, why it's important. But before that, I want to address this question. Actually, I have back here, I had it better. Is this a great books course? And what I mean by that is this a celebration of Western culture and its achievements? So if you remember back to where we started, where you saw the whole Prezi there, that's a history of Western civilization. That's just one civilization, but it's a very clear trajectory coming out of Northern Africa, sweeping into North America, and then around the world. Let me just be incredibly clear here. I can't emphasize this enough. That is not the only cultural history available on the planet. There are many other traditions. There are many other really significant traditions. So Uruk, which is the city we're going to see in the Epic of Gilgamesh, is the first large city in the West. It's a milestone achievement, but there have been many great civilizations, many great cities across the planet. So the question is, why pick this one? Is the answer that because this is the greatest civilization ever? You may have gotten that answer in a classroom 30 or 40 or 50 years ago. That's not the answer here today. The answer is we are looking at that tradition because that tradition became our tradition. And as I've said, there are things in the Epic of Gilgamesh that are still alive and well today. And that would be important for us because we're here in this tradition in the US, but it's globally important because this tradition has spread across the planet now. Many of the values and perspectives on the earth are across the planet now with this tradition. So it's just profoundly important. But let me go into that a little further. But first, let's take an iClicker poll. So I am going to start the poll here. Notice it's running here now. We have 1 minute and 28 seconds. And it's a simple question. I'm just kind of curious about your class standing. I don't care what you put down here if you don't want to be accurate, but it would be interesting for me to know, to get an idea. I can actually go through the data in the course to do this. So let me remind you while you're doing this, instead of chatting, we are going to have 3 of these in the course of the lecture today. They're embedded right into the lecture. You won't know where they are because they're not in the PF. You have to respond to 2 of the 3 of these. If you want to listen to what I'm saying, because there are people in the classroom now, I guarantee you they're going to be having trouble with this. You may not be able to get on Wi-Fi or something. If you can't get on Wi-Fi, try to get on try shutting down your Wi-Fi connection and doing it with cellular. But one of the traditional problems we've had with Wi-Fi is you need to forget the Wi-Fi network, especially if you've been here a few years and you're coming back again. Sometimes in the beginning of the term, you want to forget the Wi-Fi network and then log on again. So it has new credentials when it's logging on. It's a pain, but that might be the problem. If you have a problem still, and if, forgetting the network, trying to get on, trying again, trying with cellular, and it didn't work, come up to see us at the end of class and we'll take a list of everyone who had problems. Fingers crossed that this is not going to be a big problem this term, because they're supposed to have fixed the Wi-Fi. It's supposed to be incredible redundancy. There are access points all over, but who knows if it actually works. But hey, we just did our first poll, and yes, this one actually counts toward the grade. Okay, so this is done, and we can get back to the lecture. If you want to understand the emergence of contemporary attitudes toward the environment, you really need to see how they emerged over time, because otherwise you're not quite going to get it. So we're going to end with Silent Spring. It is where a lot of people would have started this course, I think, insofar as the modern environmental movement begins really with Silent Spring and a few other events, including the oil spill off the coast of Santa Barbara, both in the 1960s. But these are not where it begins. That it may have started there as in a kind of an official movement, but it's been going on for thousands of years. So we're going to be looking at the long history of these ideas to try to have a better idea for what's happening. Yeah, it's going to, if you wonder how we got here, and I really mean this, and this is why it's not a celebration of the West, how we got into this mess, both from an environmental point of view in terms of point source pollution and single-use plastics and all that, plus the issue of the climate crisis, why we're now at the point where we are at a pivotal point trying to resolve this problem before it becomes too late. How did we get there? Well, there are pivotal points throughout history that got us there. Things that could have changed, but didn't. And again, this is not across the planet. There are plenty of traditional cultures, indigenous cultures that had very little to do with this. Now, quote a number that I quoted again, that I quoted at the beginning of the class last time, and I'll quote it again. The poorest 5% of the poorest 3 billion people on the planet, that's not quite half, but 3 billion out of 8 billion, those people had very little to do with the climate crisis. They contributed like 5% of greenhouse gas emissions. Most of it was done by the Western world. In fact, specific Western countries, the US, the EU, and Russia contributed 2/3 of all greenhouse gas emissions. And they are all squarely in this tradition, which is why we're taking it up. And by the way, we're not celebrating the tradition. It has great points, but it also led us here in many ways. Yeah. It's not to suggest that when you read Plato, that when you read the Bible, that when you read Shakespeare, that these are, the superior to all literature. People may have argued that. Some people may still say Shakespeare is superior to any literature anywhere on the planet. I wouldn't. In part, I'm a Shakespeare specialist. I wouldn't say that. But they do, and this is like it or not, form the foundation of our culture. They play an enormous role in impacting how, and this is across the planet now, it's not only in those predominantly Western countries that I've talked about, but across the planet, those values are impacting so many people. And they impact how we inhabit the planet. So that's why we're looking at them. Not that they're they're somehow superior. Certainly wouldn't say that, but they certainly are influential. So think of it that way. This is not a great books list. This is an influential books list, influential in the West and ultimately influential across the planet. Yeah, it would be terrific if we could focus on a range of additional cultures. And I've been teaching this course since '06, and I've thought about that and thought about it, and I really don't know how to do that, only because we only have 10 weeks. The Western tradition is the principal driving force for the environmental and climate crises that we're facing, so that's the one to take up. But let me add here, getting to here. Oh, well, yeah. Just disclaimer, I'm not going to completely rag on the Western tradition throughout. I'm not going to say that, Gilgamesh is a terrible text. It's a beautiful text in many ways. Certainly has positive elements, certainly led to the creation of modern science, modern medicine, modern technology, different aspects of it. I mean, that comes from across the planet, but it's also had a horrific impact on the climate. And if you don't believe that, hang around, because you'll see the sort of impact on it. But even though we're not going to talk about a range of other cultures, we are going to conclude, after we're doing that whole trajectory, starting with Gilgamesh and ending with Thoreau and Rachel Carson, by looking at one tradition for one class, which is Buddhism. And why I selected it: first, it's still very influential. 500 million people on the planet, or nearly so, I think, self-identify as Buddhist. But the ways that culture imagines the relationship to the planet and something like your relationship to ecosystems and how we're connected is kind of startling. So I'm concluding that way, so you don't think that this is the only way to imagine our relationship to the planet. There are plenty of other ways of doing that, for sure. So let me jump then to our next one. So, what do environmental critics explore? Let me just see if we have any questions for this class. I'll jump into this and then I'll see if there are questions. It's a very important point. We explore a range, and we will in this class explore a range of literary periods as literary responses to the concerns or as old as the issues themselves. So right off the bat, you might think that the thing to explore would be 20th century or 21st century literary thinking, but it's really as old as the tradition itself. Hold on, I'm just, while we're speaking, I am going in and seeing if there are any responses to what I'm doing yet. And modules. Q&A for lecture number 1. Oh, we're already getting replies. People are, the TAs are already replying to this, so good. So right off the bat, it is not just modern periods. You might think the problems we have are principally modern problems, principally since maybe the Industrial Revolution, and as a consequence, that's what would be the subject of our inquiry, but it's not. It can be a range of periods, hence we're starting 5,000 years ago. Why? Because things like, and I mentioned this in the syllabus, deforestation, air pollution, endangered species, wetland laws, animal rights, rampant consumerism, and a host of other things have been appearing as controversial issues in the West for hundreds, and in some cases, thousands of years. You might think something like rampant consumerism is new. We're going to look at a text from 400 years ago that takes it up. 400 years ago, air pollution becomes a problem as Shakespeare's London becomes the first true fossil fuel economy on the planet. These have been around for a while, and it's important to see how they're formulated, because often the early formulation of them will continue on kind of unchanged for quite a while. So another important point, you might have come in here thinking this was literary, and the environment, and thinking, well, what are you going to look at? Like environmental poems, maybe like Wordsworth. Wordsworth has a very popular poem called Daffodils, sort of a celebration of daffodils, and you might have thought that was it. Well, right off the bat, we are going to look at poetry a little, but it can be any genre. It can be a poem, it can be a novel, it can be a play, it can be anything. It can even be something like a song lyric. And I would argue that in the 21st century, you are still inundated by environmental literature, even though it's not at all like Wordsworth Daffodils, but it has tremendous environmental import. So first off, apologies for this song. I've had this song for, I guess, a decade now, and I just think it's such a good example. I'm going to use it, but I know it's a dated song. I know it's dated. I'm sorry, but I'll use it anyhow. And that is, wait for it, Nickelback song Rockstar. It may be so old that you people don't know it. It's at least a decade old. But here's the attitude that you see here. Second paragraph. I want a brand new house on an episode of Cribs and a bathroom I can play baseball in and a king-size tub big enough for 10 people plus me. So yeah, if you know the song, yeah, do you want? So why is this important? Why in the world is this basically pretty silly song? Why does this have environmental import? So let's just kind of walk through just a cursory interpretation of this song. So here's a line. Life hasn't turned out quite the way I want it to be. So that refrain again, tell me what you want. I want. So here's the interesting thing. For thousands of years, philosophers, poets, artists, a range of different people have been speculating on what is the good life, be it love, honor, truth, beauty, equality. These, if you study the traditions, these are huge, right? So truth, aletheia in Greek, is huge for Plato. Love is huge for Plato. Honor, if you've read the Iliad, the Odyssey, Beowulf, you know honor is everything. Beauty becomes this preoccupation for literature. It dominates the Renaissance or early modern period. In the 19th century and 18th, actually, suddenly equality begins to emerge as an issue. People are thinking, well, you know, if there's one thing in life that we want, we should work for, it would be these things. And by the way, this is just scratching the surface. There are a ton of different ways that people are imagining what the good life is, what you want. And the answer here is I want a brand new house on an episode of Cribs and a bathroom I can play baseball in. Cribs, I think, is now defunct. As far as I know, is MTV defunct? I don't know. It used to be a show on MTV celebrating people that, wealthy people that had amazing, big, expansive houses. And it wasn't just this film, it's this culture, and this is our culture, this is influencer culture. I could, you know, if you were going to say this today, you would say, I want a house like a Kardashian had or something. But again, this is kind of an old song. So another version of the good life is success at obtaining and making a show of excessive wealth, which is achieved at the cost of exploiting other human beings and the planet. This culture in the US is absolutely huge. The amount of play that this gets and the celebration of excessive consumption is huge. And it has huge social justice issues, DEIJ issues, and environmental issues as well. So let me just walk through that a little. This song contains an ideology, no different than Plato's Symposium, which talks about what the greatest value in life is, which in his mind is beauty there. There's an ideology here. What is the good life? The good life is that we overexploit this planet and other human beings. That's the good life. There's no way of doing this without doing that. There's no way of having this kind of life where you have, you know, a massive house and a bathtub big enough for 10 people without exploiting the planet and other human beings. This is one silly song, but I guarantee you, if you thought about it, you could think of another dozen, many dozen songs like this, the same basic attitude. Consumption of the Earth's resources is a cornerstone of the US economy, and it's widely promoted in our popular culture, which we're now exploring to the world. So there's that number again. The poorest 3 billion people have only contributed 5% of greenhouse gas emissions. In the US, we're only 4% of the population. we've contributed 25%. But it's worse because the wealthiest 10% of people in the United States have contributed 40% of the US's greenhouse gas emissions. So if you wrote those numbers down and you do the math, here it is. If you're one of the poorest 4 billion people on the planet, your greenhouse emissions are 1/200th of a wealthy American. Expressed another way, wealthy American, the top 10% of Americans, are producing 200 times the greenhouse gas emissions than the poorest 3 billion people on the planet are per capita. And if that wasn't enough of, a scandal, it's celebrated. It's celebrated in this song. It's not just there. I mentioned Cribs. It was celebrated on MTV. It's celebrated on Instagram. It's celebrated all over the place. And it's done in an individual level. So I can tell you right now, for example, with flying, 19 out of 20 people on the planet will never step into an airplane. So right off the bat, if you take part in that, that is a practice of privilege. But if you just fly coach, that's half as bad as if you fly first class. You literally double your carbon footprint by flying first class. And if you fly in a private jet, those kind that you see pictures of all over Instagram, your carbon footprint is 20 to 40 times higher than if you're flying a personal jet, a single person in coach. And by the way, if you fly from LA to New York and back again, you've blown your whole carbon allotment for the year. Based on the standards set at COP21, which we'll talk about. So this is a rampant celebration of a lifestyle that is absolutely, impossibly unsustainable. There have been people for thousands of years who've been critical of this. They're kind of a minority. We're going to read them. We're going to read Horace, Ben Jonson, Henry David Thoreau, Sir John Denham, and others that are going to they're going to focus right in on this problem and say, yeah, this notion of having this excessive wealth that you can celebrate over other people is just a total problem. It was a problem 2,000 years ago. It was a problem 400 years ago for Ben Jonson, problem 170 years ago for Henry David Thoreau, and a huge problem for us today. And yet, go online, it's celebrated pretty much everywhere you turn. The average American consumed 18 times more resources than individuals in certain low-income countries. So some consume well over 200, and some consume well over 100, some consume well over 200. Even if so as a justice issue, first off, there are plenty of people in the US, amazingly, that produce fewer greenhouse gas emissions than people in some low to moderate income countries. So it's widely divergent who's actually causing this problem. But I can tell you one thing, the basic answer to this is wealthy people. Across the planet and in the US in particular, we have a particularly virulent strand of it. And again, it's a celebration here. I mean, if we were trying to stop this, we would write a whole different kind of narrative. We do not. This narrative dominates the society in which we live. Yeah, just think of it that way. 100 average Americans consume more natural resources than entire towns and large villages. So if you're average Americans here and there are, 860 of you here, imagine 100 times that. So 10 times that would be 8,600. 100 times that would be 86,000 people. 86,000 people is a very large town across the planet. It's just the disparity, and this as a justice issue is just absolutely startling. The thing about this, these are not innate. What I mean by that is you're not born with these attitudes. Everybody doesn't want a bathroom big enough for 10 people in there, but they're constructed, they're culturally constructed, and that we've inherited and produced. So therein lies the problem. When you're born into a culture, you're inculcated into the culture. You're taught about the values of the culture, what you should, want to have, what you feel that you should have, what you lament that you don't have. But this is not innate. Human beings aren't designed that way. You know, it's all culture. So that's why what we're doing here, and we're going to talk about that more in a few minutes, we're really looking long and hard at culture, particularly Western culture, because it is sort of the beginning of all this. This is a really good question. I think that more people should ask themselves, and that is, how do you know what we know? And you think about that, how do you know the things that you value? How do you know the things that you care about? How do you know those? You in part know them by the culture that you're born into. If you're born into different cultures, you may have entirely different values. And, when you're born into, if you're born into Gilgamesh's culture, which we'll see soon, something like mass deforestation would have been celebrated. It would have been an achievement. It would have been something great. And if you're born into our culture, unfortunately, where this over-the-top overconsumption, irrespective of how it impacts people across the planet, that's an issue. And you're going to see this, by the way, in some things like course documentaries, like The True Cost. If you haven't seen it, there's a cost to something like clothing we have. There's a cost. So you may not know this startling statistic. The average American, probably some of these statistics I like so much, I'll repeat throughout the term. The average American buys 64 items of clothing every year. That's separate from incidentals like socks and underwear. 64 items of clothing a year. How is that possible? Where are they made? Well, that documentary, The True Cost, is going to take you, among other places, to Bangladesh, and you're going to actually see the conditions under which people live who are doing things like that. So, yeah, you can look at artwork as well. By the way, I used to have here, and I used to play the songs, but it took a while, as an alternative to this, as something that tries to create a counter narrative. And it's also an old song now, but I still really like it, which is Lord's Royals, right? Listen to that song again. It's all about suggesting that this culture of opulence and all is completely overblown and ultimately won't make you happy. And it won't make you happy. Study after study proves that. After you make a certain amount of income in the US, and people debate it back and forth, but something around $70,000, your personal happiness is not going to change much. So you might think that you need millions or billions of dollars, but actually it doesn't really work that way. And in fact, can make you far less happier in the process. Okay, so you can also do this with artwork. So I'm going to show you a piece of artwork by Gustave Doré from 1860 called Niagara. It's an etching of Niagara Fall. It's one of many works that celebrated the beauty of American wilderness. In this case, this is Niagara Falls. Let me move that cursor away from there. And let me just walk through it a little to show you how this is significant. So notice the human beings here. They are exceptionally tiny. If you were to figure out the number of pixels on the screen, it'd be taking 1%, 2% of the image there. It's meant to create an image of an ideal way that humans are imagined interacting with the environment, and that is not much at all. We're going to see this with Thoreau. So there they are. The Romantic poets, and we're going to look at them, we're going to look at Shelley and Wordsworth. They have this notion of sublime, in which it is a very awe-inspiring, frightening thing, nature. Why did this happen? We'll get into it, but just as the Industrial Revolution is really picking up speed, people began to question whether that was a worthwhile project, that maybe nature was this incredibly sublime, beautiful, awe-inspiring, frightening thing. And people like Doré are depicting it here. I mean, notice these two people are on the edge of a cliff. It's not very safe. It's no doubt intensely beautiful, but at the same time, frightening. And they were remembering this view of nature. But again, this is not innate. In fact, we're going to look 200 years earlier, Shakespeare and Milton's time. People didn't feel this way about the environment at all. We'll talk about that. And how does he do that? Notice that the human beings are much smaller than and even less significant than the birds in the picture. So they're actually, if you look at the wingspan of the birds, especially the one here in the foreground, that wingspan is just massive compared to those people. It'd be like a pterodactyl or something. It'd be like a small airplane, really. But again, it's making a suggestion as how human beings should interact with the planet. We shouldn't have much to do with it. We should be pretty insignificant in our interacting with it. So let me just show you a little more of this, and then we'll get to some good stuff. Notice that the human beings here are kneeling, almost bowing down to it. We're going to see a religious reverence come to the environment. And this, by the way, is going to seem familiar when we get to it, because this is the attitude that's still alive and well today. So this is Duray, and he also did things like illustrations of the Bible and all. And this is his religious figure, and these are his people here. He's showing that the proper posture toward the environment is one of awe and frightening, but religious awe. By the time we get to John Muir is going to come right out and say the Yosemite Valley in California is like a temple. It is superior to any temple on the planet. It is the only true church. He's still believing like in God, but he's no longer buying into this older tradition, and he's just seeing nature as the real holy thing on the planet. And you can see why, with kind of religious reverence, people like John Muir are going to fight to save the environment. Yep. So religious awe. It wasn't always that way. And again, why I'm saying it's not innate. You look at John Evelyn 200 years before, and this is like in the 1860s, he takes a trip across the Alps, kind of like this, except even, bigger. And he finds it utterly disgusting. He doesn't say it's beautiful. He doesn't say it's awe-inspiring. He calls it a desert. He says that this is not something that people would ever want to be. You have to cross it if you're going from England into Italy, but it's not a good thing. It's remarkable that in 200 years, Western's attitudes changed toward the environment dramatically, but we're going to see how in 2,000 years they change a lot. So if you look at things, and it can, again, be plays, poems, novels, modern songs, it can be, things like this. It can be ads. I mean, if you look at ads for SUVs or crossovers and all, how many of those are actually plowing out through a wilderness area very quickly and all? That's a very embedded attitude toward the environment. Supposedly it's a celebration of nature. You want to go out and be somewhere where no one else is, but we'll talk about it. There's a ton of presuppositions there regarding the environment that is there. So what's the goal of the course? It's to understand how perspective on the environment that we inhabit was constructed and what it means for us today. So again, it's not innate. It's been building for the last few thousand years, and it set the stage for where we got today. It wouldn't have happened with another culture. Arguably, with most of the indigenous cultures, and there are a whole range of them in North America, this could never have happened. Why? Because the attitudes, the underlying ethics, the beliefs, the constructions were entirely different. But they, this is the one we got, and this is where it got us. So. Let's take another iClicker poll. So 90 seconds. Just curious. So first iClicker poll, I got to know what your class standing was. Whatever one of these works best. If you're in STEM fields, you just put like C or something, but I'm just curious which you have. And again, you should, if you've had a problem getting onto Wi-Fi, forgot that network and coming back on again. All right, so you see what these are. So even if you're having trouble getting on, remember your letter, because I am going to go plowing forward now. Okay, so here are some useful ideas that you want to know. For people who are talking, I could tell you these are things that way show up on exams. They're just like good things. Environmental criticism is also known as green criticism. That's principally like in Europe. We don't call it that much here, but sometimes. But the main phrase that we're using for what we do is eco-criticism. And that's a contraction for either ecological literary criticism or more broadly ecological cultural criticism. And you can see that, by the way, because we were just employing it to talk about a painting. And that's not really literary criticism, but it is cultural criticism. And by the way, that's really the end game of what we're looking for here. In other words, it's not that we're trying to understand this literature. I mean, I hope you understand the literature better than before you took the class when it's over. But the main thing that we're focusing on is the culture itself, and not Gilgamesh's culture or Shakespeare's culture, but our culture today. The literature is a way of seeing that culture better. The older cultures are a way of understanding our culture today. But that's really it, and I'll explain that shortly. Just to be very clear, by environment, some people will often think that that just means wilderness, like, Yosemite, that's the environment. But environment can be any kind of environment. It can be wilderness or what we call built environment. It can be a farm, it can be a suburb, it can be a city, it can be a factory, it can be anything at all. Some of those environments are endangered, some are virtually untouched. Very little, by the way, is untouched now in the 21st. Something like 90% of the landmass of the planet is directly under human control. And the last 10% are things that we're not too interested in. Otherwise, we would be controlling them. But environment can be anything. So I already said this about it can be any genre that we look at, whether it's poems, whether it's music, whether it's whatever, but not just nature writing. And we will look at some nature writing, some celebrations of it. But for the most part, we're going to be looking at things that are, not as pleasant in a celebration of nature, but trying to understand what's happening to the planet today. That's the real goal. So the word ecology, just so we're clear on this, was coined in 1866, and this was shortly after Darwin introduced the theory of evolution by a German, another biologist named Ernst Haeckel. And ecology, and we'll really get to this, we'll see it kind of throughout the term, but especially when we get to Rachel Carson and then Buddhism, it means that all life on Earth is connected. And this is a relatively new term in the West coming on the scene in 1866. It is not a new term in Buddhism where 2,600 years ago, the Buddha is talking about it, but here we are. And it's a cornerstone of thinking across the planet for other people for thousands of years. And the idea here is very simple, and this is what Hegel was frustrated with, that you could look at the individual biology of an individual animal, say a mouse, or the individual biology of a raccoon, and that would be fine. But what do you do if you want to think about an area where mice and raccoons live together and how they interact? For that, there really wasn't a term and a way to understand that, and he suggests the word ecology. And our related word, of course, is ecosystem. So if you're looking at an ecosystem and you're trying to figure out how, mice and raccoons relate, that's how you do it. It's been profoundly influential, and depending on your field of interest, you may know that many biology departments across the US are no longer called just biology departments. They're called like biology and ecology, biology and evolutionary ecology, or something of the sort. So this notion that you can think of anything in isolation is no longer widespread in the US at all. But that's striking to think that this is only 150 years old. Before that, we tend to think of things in isolation. For the climate crisis and all, we can no longer think of things in isolation. We have to think of them as deeply connected. Just so you know, I doubt it will be on the test. Etymologically, ecology comes from two words, and this is what Hegel used. He knew Greek, of course, oikos, which means household, and logos, which means study. And it's interesting because he had plenty of words other than oikos available, but he wanted to think of creatures living in or life in an ecosystem are kind of like in a house together. They're all housemates, they're all related. What one does impacts the other. And really, it's a good way to kind of think about life in general or the planet. I mean, we're in the middle of a sixth extinction event where life is dying across the planet, but to think of how we're interrelated to all that. And we will get to that in some detail. So why approach environmental issues from a literary perspective? It's what we're doing. Why not, for example, approach these issues from other perspectives, eco-philosophy, eco-ecology, eco-theology, or in fact, the natural sciences? Let me just be very clear. These are all valid things to do, valid approaches. In fact, we're going to be doing eco-philosophy, eco-psychology, and eco-theology. But I'm going to make a specific pitch for what we're doing. It is not to say that it's superior to any of these, but I am going to show you the particular advantage of this approach, this cultural studies approach. But by all means, if you want to study any of these other things, you should absolutely do it. Again, it's not to put these down, it's just to say what we're doing. Yeah, and just to be very clear about that, something like the natural sciences are very important. Technology is very important, but less so than many of us might think. And at this point, we have a great deal of the technology that we need to solve the climate crisis, but we need cultural changes, and those are the changes that we're not making. And many of them have nothing to do with ecology whatsoever. So I'm sorry, with the hard sciences or technology whatsoever. So something like, if every American stopped eating beef, well, 15% of greenhouse gas emissions would be slashed right there, but 40% of the continent would be opened up. Like 41% of the United States is used to raise beef. If we stop that, the amount of new ecosystems and rewilding we could do, the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, especially methane, which is problematic, industrial runoff, agribusiness and all would be huge. So all these things are important, but again, this class is all about culture, or the primary focus anyhow. But we will be employing eco-philosophy, eco-psychology, eco-theology very soon. So eco-theology, we're even going to be talking about it with Gilgamesh's religion as early as Thursday, and then eco-theology will be jumping in really with both feet next week when we look at the Judeo-Christian tradition. And then right after that, we're going to be looking at Plato and Socrates, and we'll be looking at eco-philosophy. So we're going to be doing all that. In that sense, it's an introduction to the environmental humanities. But again, the pitch I'm going to make to you right now is that a literary cultural approach in the form of cultural historical analysis is uniquely useful. Again, not better, but particularly useful. But to do that, we have to ask this even more basic question. And I kind of been hinting at it all along. So this right now, I kind of just answered that. Why approach from an environmental these issues from a literary cultural perspective? Well, they have advantages, but let's look at this basic question that I think every English literature class, many classes should ask this question. Why do we read and study at all? There are different answers to this. Diversion is one for anybody who's just, read or doom scrolled or something like that. It's just, something to pass the time, diversion. That's not wrong. There's nothing wrong about that. Pleasure, often a vicarious pleasure. You imagine yourself in situations. That's been a mainstay of novels for 3 centuries rather. Certainly a good reason. You can tell I'm not going to stop on these. I have something else in mind. Education and edification. I mean, that's why you're here in university. You're going to learn things through reading things. Certainly important. And I wouldn't deny any of this. But again, I have something else I'm going toward here. You can tell I like this one. It's much longer. It's to understand human nature, insofar as human nature and what we value, such as beauty, does not change over time. This is known as new criticism. This is a form of cultural and especially literary criticism. It was enormously influential in the 1970s, and it's still around. You may have had this approach in high school. And it argues that history is pretty much irrelevant, as certain enduring ideas, these are like Platonic ideas, like beauty, presumably don't change over time. So what do I mean by that? Let's take the idea of love. Well, you could read Sappho writing about love, intensely beautiful poems in the 7th century before the Christian era. You could read Shakespeare writing about love over 2,000 years later, or you could read a contemporary novelist writing about love like Zadie Smith today. And the argument would be, well, you can do this because love is love. It doesn't change. It is a basic human thing. It is built into us to feel love. Well, the problem with that is, and I'll get to this in a minute, these are all culturally constructed ideas of what love is, and they all depend on the particular moment of history. New criticism is alive in a certain sense today, and it's, it's still taught because it's very easy to teach in a way. But I mean, right away you can see the problem, right? Because, do you really think that love was the same 2,700 years ago in Greek culture? And do you really think that the contemporary American view of love is going to work with someone like Sappho, who was writing about same-sex love, or about Shakespeare, who was alternately writing about love for dark lady and a young man at the same time? I mean, notions of love change a lot, and no more, I would argue hardly any time have they ever changed more than the last few decades, where it's constantly in flux and fluid, and that's good. And the fluidity is sort of a cornerstone of what we mean by love. But this view says, nah, it's all the same. Love is love. We can always talk about it. And if you read Shakespeare, no matter who you are, you're going to, get that. Oh, sorry. I think I jumped to the wrong thing. So let me see if I can get out of here. Hold on, I might have actually done the right thing and didn't know it. Okay, human nature, that's new criticism. I did the right thing. Another big one here. Another approach is to understand history. And so how does that work? You read Shakespeare not to read about an enduring transhistorical idea like love, but you read about Shakespeare to understand 400 years ago in England. You want to understand that culture. And that's interesting. It is interesting. I wouldn't deny it. And people fall down those rabbit holes all the time and spend their lives, scholars do, kind of living in the 16th century England. But the problem with that is it's just not very relevant today. You can learn things about it, but I mean, how does that impact us today? It wasn't very popular, this approach, because it's very time consuming and you have to do an awful lot of reading about the context. But the bigger issue is, what's the payout? In other words, how does this impact us today? This course is designed to be relevant today. It's designed to be important for the way that you think in the 21st century. If we just focus on the way that people in Shakespeare's era thought, yeah, that's interesting and all, I wouldn't deny it, but how relevant is that in the 21st? So, these are all important reasons. So not only what I gave first, like pleasure and diversion and all, but new criticism, traditional historical analysis, but there's something perhaps more important. And that is, and this is the end game of this class, is to understand our culture, to understand about our culture from its past. And that's generally referred as new historicism. It's kind of old and done now, but it was very important. But that's really what we're here for. We're not here to understand Gilgamesh's culture. We're not to understand what love meant to Gilgamesh and all. That's interesting, but all these texts, everything in the reader, are little excerpts put together to tell you more and more and more about our culture. But it even gets better. And let me go this last one here. To understand not just our culture, but ourselves as constructed culturally, historically. So Why do you believe what you do about the environment? Why do you hold those attitudes that you do? Why do you think something like Yosemite is beautiful and valuable and worthwhile and should be, saved? That's not something you were born with. That's something that's been brewing for thousands of years. You were born in this culture. You could have been born in any culture. Philosopher Martin Heidegger says we're thrown into a culture at birth. And we are. We're just randomly thrown into a culture, and we take on the values of that culture. And those are your values today. And it's important because we need to change a lot of our thinking about our relationship to this planet if we are to get through this. It is probably the largest existential crisis our species has ever had. So to do that, we need to think about what it is we believe and why we believe what we do. So, New Historicism. Hey, let's take another iClicker poll. So this is number 3. Remember, you need to have answered 2 of the 3. If you didn't, you'll come up here at the end. And I'm curious about this question, how you feel about the climate crisis. And I don't care what you think, but I'm just curious. And I can tell you that having taught these courses for well over a decade, this is changing now, what you feel, what every new generation of students is feeling. And it's pretty striking. So we're going to talk about this as we go through the course, but let me just jump to the next thing. Okay, so back to what we were talking about here, and just so you have it for your notes, we're talking about New Historicism. And that approach came on the scene right around 1980, a book called Renaissance Self-Fashioning, but it remains extraordinarily influential and important today, even though it's morphed into other things. But just to be clear, it's called New Historicism, but it's no longer old. It's 40 years old. No longer new. It's 40 years old at this point. So you want to know this. It requires a great deal of research, and it's not easily imported into the classroom, but it has certain advantages. So what is it doing? I'm giving you this because this is sort of an overarching blueprint of what we're doing in this class. It uses history in the form of texts from past cultures, i.e. all those texts in your reader. And what is it doing it for? Not to interpret the past, not to interpret Gilgamesh's culture or Shakespeare's culture, but to interpret the present. By that, I mean this third decade of the 21st. Hence, it promises to make past ancient literary and literature and culture relevant today. So why are we reading these old texts? It's not to read them. It's not because they're that important. It's not because it's that cool the way that Gilgamesh lived. But what does this tell us about where we are today? But again, it's not just telling us something about modern American culture, modern US culture. It does, sure. But, and this is what I think this class, I hope for you is a personal experience, because it tells you about ourselves, because we come to be in a historical cultural context. You all were probably, or most of you were born in the 21st. All this came together for you. All these things that you were taught and learned and took upon yourself to be your beliefs. It's because, as I mentioned here a minute ago, because we're just thrown into a culture. And when you take on those values of a culture. But I can tell you this right now, and I want to take a sip of water before I say it. The absolute challenge for your generation is to look hard and long at these beliefs, because they are no longer working. They are not sustainable. And the generation that came before you and the generation before that had values that just don't work, full stop. What I mean by that is, I mentioned it before, last class, say it again, probably say it more than once after this. Since 1945 or so, a single generation, the generation of the age of like Donald Trump and Joe Biden, 85 to 90% of all greenhouse gas emissions were put there in their lifetime. In a single lifetime, in wealthy countries, the climate crisis was created. because that group of people had certain values that allowed them to do what they did. If they had not done that, if they had come from a different cultural background, this never would have happened. The problem is, many of you have been raised by people with those values. You've been raised in a culture, forget your individual parents or relatives, but you've been raised in a culture, you go online, you watch TV, you see these values, and those values have not changed. And as a consequence, you may have heard, it's a big milestone in 2015. It was the Paris Agreement. It was at COP21. 195 nations of the planet got together and said, it's fine, we're going to solve this problem. We're going to slow down and eventually stop greenhouse gas emissions. But the cultures did not change. And what happened since 2015 is incredibly depressing, because not only didn't we level off greenhouse gas emissions, they didn't level off. Not only did we keep them from growing the way they were, they kept growing. But since 2015, when everyone got together to say it, greenhouse emissions have gone up. They haven't leveled off, they haven't dropped, they haven't gone down. That's where we are. And that has to change. It is no way that we can do this. We are, it was very clear from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which gave the science that was the basis for COP21, that we had to cut greenhouse gas emissions in half by 2030. 2015, that was like, okay, 15 years to do it. We can do this. We can cut it in half. Well, if you do the math, you know that we're just past halfway point there. We did not do any of it. We didn't even slow it down, and we kept increasing emissions. So this is a problem. But to change it, you have to change the way we think about the relationship that this species has to a planet, has to our planet. And yeah, so let me just go over this. So just so you understand the process, this is traditional historicism. I'm going to visually put it. I use an old text like Hesiod, which we'll be reading. He's in the reader. And what do you do with that? You use it to interpret. And interpretation has another word, which is hermeneutics. It's the science of interpretation. You use it to interpret a historical culture, like the Greek culture. And again, this is all interesting. You read Hesiod, you understand Greek culture more, that's great. But how relevant is that today? That's where traditional historicism has a problem. It promises that it's going to give you insight into the past cultures, but it's entirely directed to the past. I mean, look at that arrow. That arrow is pointing back in history. It does not tell us anything about our culture today. It's backwards focus. It's looking back in history. New historicism, this is what basically we're doing, and this is why it's different. Same thing. Use Hesiod to interpret hermeneutics, historical culture. So let's specifically talk about what Hesiod talks about, and we're going to deal with this in detail, but I'll give it to you now. Hesiod believed that there was something once called the Golden Age, very much like Eden in the Judeo-Christian tradition, when human beings had a perfect relationship to the planet. So if you read Hesiod, you can learn that that's what people thought. And Hesiod is pretty much a contemporary of Homer, so 2,700 years ago or so. So that's cool. Tells you something about Greek culture. But this allows us to do more, and that is to interpret. Notice the arrows change. We're moving back from history forward, our present day culture, ideas, and selves. So what do I mean by that? The belief that human beings once had a perfect relationship with the earth, which is by no means innate and is rather a culturally constructed idea that we in part inherited from the ancient Greeks. So what do I mean by that? If you look at the history of Western civilization, starting with Gilgamesh, starting before, we have never been a sustainable species, ever. We have been doing mass deforestation, mass changes to the environment, mass overexploitation, and there has never been a moment. You can go back as far as you want. You can go back 500 years, 5,000 years, 50,000 years. Our species has never been a very sustainable species on the planet. But this belief that we lived at peace with the planet, whether that's in Eden or the Golden Age, or you believe in some culture on the planet somewhere that we were totally at peace, where does that come from? Yeah, it doesn't really come from the historical record. it comes from these stories that we've been getting. And this story, by the way, I can tell you, is so common, so incredibly pervasive, because it's not only Hesiod, it's the story of Eden. Why is that important? Half the planet are Christians, or believe in the story of Eden, Christian or Muslim. And it has other aspects to it. And we're going to see this pastoral tradition, which is incredibly important. What it all boils down to is, I suspect, I should have actually done an iClicker poll on this. How many people believe that at some time human beings actually live sustainably on the planet? I think many people do, not because of the historical record, but because of what these texts tell us. So this is called a hermeneutic circle, because knowing this, you can go back and read Hesiod again, and it will appear in a different light, because you came into Hesiod already believing what Hesiod was telling you. And why did you believe what Hesiod is telling you? Because you got it from other sources. And you may not know where you got all this, and it may be, things you never thought of. Like you've seen the Disney movie Pocahontas. Pocahontas makes very clear that the Native American culture there had a sustainable culture on the planet. Far more sustainable than Western culture, far more sustainable than European culture now or then, but not perfect, not sustainable at all. Where does this notion of a perfect culture come from? And again, doesn't come from, well, I say historical record, but I could just as well say it doesn't come from reality. It comes from this tradition that we've had for a long time. It's been around, this approach, just to situate it historically. Even as early as like Martin Heidegger, but it really comes on the scene with Friedrich Nietzsche, phenomenologists like Husserl and Heidegger, and Heidegger's student Gadamer. And Foucault was influenced by Heidegger, and then Stephen Greenblatt influenced by Foucault, who coined the phrase New Historicism. But it makes clear that a cultural analysis by way of historical interpretation brings something unique to the table, unlike something, say, from the hard sciences or any field of inquiry. And it allows us to interpret our culture today, and not just our culture, but ourselves. So you can sit down and think not about what Western culture believes, but what you believe. So it answers a question, and this is where we're going to end. It answers both of our questions here, right? So one, why do we read and study literature at all? You can read it for diversion and pleasure and all that, but we read it and study it in order to better understand our culture and ourselves. So in that sense, it's not dusty old history, but I would argue, and I'm going to make the case throughout this course, it is relevant, it is important. If nothing else, I hope you leave here thinking that this mattered, that this was important. So yeah, that's one reason to read, a really good one. And why approach environmental issues from a literary perspective? It allows us to better understand the relationship that we have to the environment, how it emerged historically, and our individual feelings. Okay, that's it. We're done. So see you on Thursday. Well, there's a little end. Okay.